I feel a bit of a fraud being here amongst so many experts and, well, beyond aficionados, Wilde experts, well, obsessives almost. It's almost like being in the centre of Oscar Wilde cult. And I'm sure you all know much, much more about Oscar Wilde than I do. I produced all 4 of Oscar's plays in the Vaudeville through the late autumn of 2017 through the whole of 2018, and had an absolutely fine time doing it. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But also since then, I got the most lovely project for lockdown, which was a commission to write a book about the greatest first nights and openings and sort of seismic events in the history of art. And it's all about moments when art of a certain provenance and a certain quality and a certain mould-breaking radical risk met an audience that was ready to take it, and how when that happens, when you have a large audience and you have something really brand new, the audience can be the most extraordinary enhancer. They can lift something and take it to another place. And often they're a lot more radical and a lot more open than the Academy. The Academy can be very stiff, it can be very conservative, it can be very difficult, but an audience presented with something very bold can just triumphantly say yes in a very automatic and quick way. And this book is about those events, a wide variety of things, from Sex Pistols in Manchester, which I can see is going to appeal to almost everyone here, through to Michelangelo unveiling David, through to the opening night of Monteverdi's L'Orfeo. But one chapter is about the opening night of Importance of Being Earnest. So I thought I'd read you a couple of little bits from that, and then intersperse that with just talking a little bit about the season that I did. So this is from my chapter on Oscar. And you'll recognise some of it. A lot of it is drawn from books you'll know. The most wonderful, kind Canadian man called Joseph Donahue. I don't know if is he part of your society?
Well, he contributes.
He sent me his sort of reconstructed critical edition of The First Night, and it's just the book that everybody would dream of having about their first night. So he was a help, but you'll know some of this, and hopefully some of it will be a bit of a surprise. St. Valentine's Day, 14th of February, 1895. A snowstorm swirled outside the St. James's Theatre on London's King Street between 7 and 8 in the evening, as a street-wide tangle of hansom cabs barged past each other to deliver their cargo of glitterati. The drifting snow made the jostle the more confused, and the picture all the more magical. Horses and polished wood scraped past each other, spilling out the wealthy and well thought of. A small crowd had gathered to gawp at the gentry in their gems, and amongst them was a claque of wild fanatics, waiting to cheer their man to the opening night of The Importance of Being Earnest. Wilde did not disappoint, pulling up in a carriage and stepping down with the practiced deportment of a debutante. His outfit was one of elaborate dandyism and a sort of florid sobriety. He wore a coat with a black velvet collar and a white waistcoat, from which dangled a bunch of seals on a black ribbon watch chain. His white gloves were held lightly in one hand, leaving his green scarab ring visible. As his friend Ada Levison remembered, this costume, which on another man might have appeared perilously like fancy dress, and on his imitators was nothing less, seemed to suit him perfectly. He seemed to have the look of the last gentleman in Europe. As he stepped into the throng, he sprayed performative wit left and right. This, his 4th opening in recent succession, drew a crowd as much for his talent to amuse as for the play itself. Surrounded by la crème, he received their adulation with a semi-royal graciousness. The facade of dazzling gaiety needed energy to fund its bright wattage. Most of the energy came from terror. Oscar had just returned from a trip to Algeria, quite possibly with gonorrhea. The effects of the illness and of its medieval cure would have been spiking his body with tortures. For several years he'd been leading a Disneyingly executed double life as a devoted husband and father in the public eye, while in secret living out a long and bitter romance with Lord Alfred Douglas, in the course of which both took prodigious pleasure elsewhere. It was a pirouette of publicity and secrecy which took enormous effort to sustain. He knew this tightly woven double helix would soon unthread. One specific threat lurked in the corners of his paranoia. The Marquis of Queensberry, father of his lover, Lord Alfred Douglas, had threatened to attend the night and ruin it. Tipped off by Queensberry's ex-wife, his ticket for the night had been withdrawn by the business manager of the St. James, but the threat remained. As Oscar entertained his captive crowd with poise and pose, he would have looked with a flicker of nervousness over and beyond them, and seen police officers discreetly placed around the building, there to stop a Queensberry disturbance. Oscar was walking close to the precipice, as he always did. His whole life was foreshadowed by a sense of the skull beneath the skin. Within his glamorous garb would have been secreted the one item he always kept with him, the last personal possession he retained on his deathbed, a locket enclosing a lock of his younger sister's hair, Isola. His lodestar had died at 8 and taken a fair chunk of Oscar's young heart with her. The sense of doom this inculcated in Oscar, along with other family calamities, was one of the factors which helped him to rebound and fly so high. On that St. Valentine's night, he did not know if he was to be allowed one more magical evening. So that's a bit from the book. Great. I'm going to talk a bit now about the season that I did and why I did it. I think I left the Globe, and the thing that I learned most from the Globe was how important architecture is to theatre and how important architecture is to play. We tend to isolate plays off from the architecture that surrounds them, and it's a mistake. Shakespeare works best for me in the architecture which was built to support those plays. Every exit, every entrance, the pace, the way that music coincides with the action, the relationship with the audience, the fact that you've got groundings underneath you, the fact that you're all in a shared light and the contact you make is direct with people, you look at them straight in the eye. All of that is what Shakespeare wrote for, and when you do it in those environments, you release something, you release an energy in the heart of the plays. If you do Shakespeare in a Victorian theatre under light, for me it doesn't make any sense. If you've got actors who are sort of looking above the audience and going la 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 into a band of lights, it sort of takes the boldness and the clarity and the directness of the communication away from Shakespeare. So that was what I learned. And so after I'd left and I was doing a variety of things, I made some films, I wrote a book about one of the things we've done at the Globe. I was looking to and talking to people about doing things in the West End. And what I wanted to do was celebrate the architecture of the West End and to look at proscenium arches, which is fundamentally the architecture of almost every West End theatre, and work out what the writing was that was appropriate to those spaces and how we could make the same sort of marriage between writing and architecture that we did with Shakespeare. Because I love proscenium theatre, but I love it as it's meant to be. You know, I love it with a curtain that's down at the beginning of the evening. So you sit there and then you have a reveal when the curtain goes up, and you have a sense in an audience of going, you know, a gasp of surprise and excitement and tension about what the evening might hold. I love intervals. Theatre should have intervals. Writers wrote for intervals. That was part of the structure of an evening. With Chekhov's plays, he wrote for 3 intervals in his 4-act plays, each of which would have been 35 to 40 minutes long. And he wrote for them, so he wrote enough life, drama, excitement, richness, whatever, within an act that you then needed a breather. And you needed to go out and have a sherbet ice or a drink, and you needed to flirt with someone and have a fight with someone and gossip with someone and take your mind off it before you went back in for more. So when we see Chekhov and it's like one long stretch, it's agony, because it's not what was intended, it's too much for the human mind to take. And I love the picture frame more than anything. I mean, it's an obvious thing to say, and it's a dumb thing to say, but the proscenium is about a picture frame. I was talking to Robert, and he knows much more about this than I do, and he sent me a lovely article about proscenium. But, essentially it has that gold picture frame around it, and in the imagination of authors, there is something painterly about how they want their drama to be enacted within that frame. A lot of great writers are painters as well. Coward was a great painter. David Story was a great painter. I don't think Oscar was a great painter, correct me if I'm wrong.
No, he did a bit.
He did a bit, but he knew what he was doing. So when they imagined the scene, they imagined it as a sort of moving three-dimensional painting. And that's not to say that's better than Shakespeare's theatre or modern studio theatres or thrust theatres or whatever, but it is very specifically what they wrote for. So I wanted to do a season where there was that relationship between the writing and the theatre that surrounded it. Then why Oscar? I love his writing. It's a dumb thing to say. I'm amongst the already converted. I've always found something special and particular about him. I've always found something mischievous, which I love. I've always found a radical, discreetly radical energy coming through. I think two other things triggered it in a way. One was I went to the British Library doing something else and was shown some of Oscar's notebooks, and that gave me an insight. I don't know if any of you have seen them there. I'm sure you have. But what's amazing is how musical his impulse was that he started just writing reams of dialogue without having any idea what the plot of the play might be, or where it might go in a play, or who might be saying it. So you just see somebody like a musician scratching notes or playing with chords or thinking about a tune. You just see these, bom, 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 lovely little delicate exchanges, very fine, very witty, very bright. Not jokes, but just the music of dialogue and the music of interchange. And I found that fascinating to start understanding how he wrote. And I think he says somewhere that, writing is just a matter of thinking of a plot and then attaching dialogue you've already written to it. But it was very graphically demonstrated in this. And I got a sense of how much he heard what he wrote. So it's not a mental construct. It's not sitting down and going, I am going to write a play on this theme. It's just hearing sort of tunes on the breeze and catching them, writing them down, and then forming them into a play. I found that fascinating. And then I went to that wonderful exhibition at Reading Jail that Art Angel supported. I don't know if any of you went to it, but it was very powerful and very moving, going in and looking around it and sitting in his cell and having a lovely quiet moment in there, late on an afternoon, the sun coming in, not much noise outside, and just being able to in some way imagine what his life might have been like when he was in there, and then going into the cell next door and seeing a line of books on a table, and they were the books that he first asked to be brought in by the governor of the prison after he'd been there for about a year. And I looked at them and I wasn't looking for anything in particular. And you could see that there were a couple of pious books about Christianity, Catholicism and whatever, which were in some way an attempt to sort of look good for the governor and get on the right side of it from him. And then there were a couple of novels, and at the end was the complete works of Strindberg and Little Eyolf by Ibsen. And it was a total surprise that, what he most wanted to read at that moment were plays by his contemporaries and plays by European contemporaries. And it made him instantly much more of a theatre animal and much more of a European and much more, these writers were at that time the most radical act in town and the most dangerous act in town. And he was saying they're my allies, which is something I'd never thought. I'd put him in an English tradition, and a long English tradition, and a glorious English tradition, but I'd never understood how much he sort of caught the pulse of what else was going on at that time. And then when we decided we were going to land in the Vaudeville Theatre, and we looked out from the Vaudeville, and I saw that opposite the Vaudeville is that tiny little alleyway, which has now got a gate sort of permanently closed in front of it. But down that alleyway is the street where Oscar first landed when he came to London, and where he held his wild parties and held a salon. And then I knew that he'd come up, walk up onto the Strand, and look across and see the Vaudeville. And the Vaudeville was the theatre in which the marvellous Elizabeth Robbins, who was one of the most brilliant entrepreneurs of her own day, a woman, formed a theatre club, and in that theatre club put on the plays of Ibsen and put on the plays of Strindberg, and did as much to sort of radically change English theatre as anyone has. And so it all started to make sense, and it all started to come together. How am I doing for time?
You're okay, 5 minutes.
Right, we have enough yet. We have enough. Sure? So we said that. I'm going to read you one more bit from the book, and then I'll just wrap up by telling you a bit more about the season and why it was special. And then if any of you have got any questions, feel free to shout them out. The books tend to sort of dance around in each chapter and talk about the backstory of these various people, but then I come back to the central focus, which is the night itself. So this is about how that night in 1895 continued. Fireworks. With such a kaleidoscope of pressures bearing down, it was unkind of the weather to join in. Levison described the 14th of February as a dark, sinister winter's night. A black, bitter, threatening wind blew the drifting snow. Yet somehow, with the magic of theatrical possibility, once the assembled crowd of chaps with capes and canes and toppers and ladies in pearls and ball gowns assemble in the warmth, a giddy sensation of delight enveloped them. Outside a frost, inside the very breath of success, perfumed atmosphere of gaiety, fashion and everlasting popularity. The author of the play was fertile, inventive, brilliant. Oscar had decreed that the flower of the night was not to be the usual carnation, but to be the lily of the valley in honour of an absent friend, Bosie, who was still up the mountain in Algeria. And everyone was duly wearing them. Eager young dandies crammed lilies into their buttonholes just to be perverse. Oscar defied his own decree, and in his buttonhole a single green carnation bloomed savagely. Beaming with euphoria, he glided through the rippling, glittering, chattering crowd, spraying witticisms like confetti. One can only pity, this is something I didn't realise until I read the Joseph Donoghue book, the poor curtain raiser. Did you realise there was a curtain raiser that night? Poor man. A short and inoffensive play called In the Season by Langdon Mitchell. Many had stayed at dinner an extra 20 minutes in order to miss it. Others casually walked in during it, naturally. The resplendent assembly was full of expectation, and it wasn't for that. As the orchestra of Walter Slaughter finished their interlude music, and the of-the-moment electric lights dimmed, the crowd silenced themselves to a held hush. The curtain rose to the sound of an off-stage piano. A journeyman actor, F. Kinsey Peele, was cast as Lane, Algernon's deadpan butler. After his first scene, he came off, and George Alexander came up to him in the wings and whispered, "Congratulations. You will always have the pleasure of remembering that you got the first laugh in the Importance of Being Earnest." He himself remembered the play was received with roars of merriment from beginning to end. The grand dame herself, Rose the clerk, had a cold and was not at her best, but still managed to land her iconic zingers, including the triple-syllable legend, a handbag. The evening galloped along, aided by Alexander's pruning, and manifested Wilde's insistence that a farce must be played like a pistol shot. As if the audience were all under the same intense pressure as Oscar, they backflipped with the same insouciance into joy, and exemplified the same unbearable lightness of being. Levison spotted a strange, almost hysterical joy At the conclusion, the applause was delirious, and it grew when Oscar appeared for his bow. There was no speech. When an actor asked Wilde earlier if he was going to say something, he replied, "I don't think I shall take a call tonight. You see, I took one only last month at the Haymarket, and one feels so much like a German band." Maybe he did not want to tempt Providence, nor did he know for certain where his tormentor was. Backstage, he managed to compliment himself. "I've taken the drama, the most objective form known to art, and made it into as personal a mode of expression as the lyric or the sonnet. And to deliver the most delicious backhanded compliment to Alexander. My dear Alec, it was charming, quite charming. And you know, from time to time, I was reminded of a play I once wrote myself called The Importance of Being Earnest." Despite his on-stage silence, the noise of the applause and the warmth within it must have been a balm. It never got better than this for him. It was the last moment of triumph in his topsy-turvy life. There's more where that came from, but I'll get back to the season. The season was just a delight. We did the 4 society plays. We didn't do Vera the Nihilist or the Duchess Padra for very good reason. How many people have read those? You're familiar. Well
I've seen the
done.
Duchess of Padra.
Have you?
Yes.
Good Lord. We didn't do that, but we put in a couple of sort of amuse-bouches amongst the plays, where Simon Cano came and did De Profundis, in a very painful and beautiful and honest, straight performance. And then Guy Chambers, who is a brilliant composer who writes most of Robbie Williams' big hits, did a really beautiful version of The Selfish Giant, which was staged by Bill Buckhurst. We had such fun doing the plays, uncovering some new things, celebrating some old things, allowing all of that energy and that wit and that mischief into the room. I think what overpowered me more than anything about the plays was mercy more than anything else, and forgiveness more than anything else. There was an explosion just as we were about to start the season. Me Too went kaboom, and there was a sort of huge amount of noise about that, and just noise and good noise and right noise, and it was the right thing that was said, and it was in many ways long overdue, but it was followed up by a huge amount of very severe judgment about behaviour, about who was good and who was bad. And I think one of the glories of Oscar's plays is that you often discover that the seemingly good person and the person who is quickest to judge and quickest to accuse and quickest to live in a very high moral stance is actually the person who has the least justification for doing it, and that the seeming villain and the seeming person without a moral compass has a capacity for generosity and for kindness and for warmth and for looking after the sinner in any situation, which defies any expectations and which overturns your understanding of things. And it's very formidable when you see that pattern in action in play after play after play, how Mrs. Erlin in Lady Windermere's Fan is, not the first person to speak and shout about her morals, but she's the first person to act with kindness, to look after other people, and how that is reflected through many of the plays. Most brilliantly, probably in Ideal Husband, which is one of his best sort of judged moral dramas. And so there was a moment when we were doing The Ideal Husband when it seemed like almost every person who'd been publicly outed across the world for Me Too crimes was coming to London and was sneaking in to see The Ideal Husband. It's extraordinary. They were coming from Australia, they were coming from California, they had bags on their heads. They were going in just for a little bit of Oscar's mercy and Oscar's generosity and Oscar's understanding. Because I think he understood the English particularly, but everyone, when they start getting moral about personal matters and start getting moral about matters of love and matters of sex, they do get into the most awful muddle. And just the expanse and his generosity really overwhelmed me and all of us that worked, and we were just very grateful to be in his company because it was such a kind company. That was one thing, and the other thing was, as well as it being an era of judgment, it was an era when the judgment was most often expressed in the tweet or the Instagram post or the short message on social media. And I think what was really noticeable was how Oscar could hold in a sentence 3 different points of view and balance them exquisitely, and then throw a mist of irony across those 3 different points of view, so you were never aware of what his own position was, or what the character's position was, or how these very difficult, conflicting thoughts might reconcile themselves. And in the era of the sort of hammer-headed tweet or the loud and aggressive Instagram post, it was such a delight to be in the presence of that complexity of thinking. And a lot of people these days, call out for nuance. There has never been any better exhibitor of nuance at every single moment than Oscar. And so both of those things, it felt like it was exciting to do it at that moment, and it felt by the end of the year and through that year that it was sort of necessary to do it. I hope I haven't spoiled Oscar for the West End, because I noticed there hasn't been any since. But you'll also notice that the number of plays is in rapid decline in the West End as the musical crawls in and eats up everything like very aggressive weeds in the field. And there's not going to be a lot of room left for plays in the future. So although I think I probably sated the appetite of the public on Oscar, I also think it was rather a wonderful last hurrah for him before the barbarians take over. Anyway, thank you very much. It's a great honour to be here. It's a great pleasure to speak to you.
Great pleasure for me to be asked to do the vote of thanks to Dominic, because I'm full of admiration for what he did with that classic spring season. It was the first time in the history of the London theatre that a West End theatre has been given over to the works of one author for an entire year. When it was first announced, I thought, I wonder if it will actually make the end of the year. Because seasons in the West End are very difficult. If the public don't come, then you're closing in 2 weeks. Not only did Dominic do the entire year, it was a tremendous success. It was hit after hit. As Dominic says, the straight play has become an endangered species in the West End. It's very difficult to put on an intelligent play and attract an audience, but Dominic managed that for an entire 12 months. When his book appeared last year, Astonish Me, of which we're selling the paperback tonight, I knew he'd be the perfect person to write it, because he works in that world in which you understand the importance of the first appearance of a work of art that actually changes the way in which people think. And his book covers such a wide range of works of art, from Michelangelo's David to Handel's Messiah, from Manet's Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe to Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. Who else could have written such a book? Of course, when I got the book, and I'm sure this is true of everybody sitting here who's read it, the first chapter I looked at was The Importance of Being Earnest. Because who was better at first nights than Oscar? Dominic describes Oscar as a maestro of first nights, a prodigy of premieres. A wonderful phrase. A long time ago, the poet Alexander Pope said, nature's chief masterpiece is writing well. I think he was overstating it a bit. It's not nature's chief masterpiece, but it is certainly a very rare masterpiece. There are many people who've lived interesting lives and have interesting experiences, but just can't put the words together on the page in a way that really grabs the reader. But Dominic can. In this chapter he writes about the way in which Oscar was leading these two extraordinary lives, the public life, the high-profile, glamorous, glittery society figure, and the private life, which threatened to overwhelm the public life. He calls it, in the passage he read out tonight, the double helix. And the double helix was twisting itself very tight on that first night of The Importance of Being Earnest. Of course, it was a triumph. Dominic writes towards the end of the chapter, but somewhere he knew that there was a completeness to his life and art, and in earnest he had spent accumulated wealth he could never recoup. He may have been ready for martyrdom. Of course, when I read that, I knew I had to read the rest of the book. And I sincerely hope you will all read the book, which I will be selling at the knockdown price of £10 at the back as soon as we finish talking. And Dominic will be very happy to sign copies. Dominic, as a small thank you for your talk tonight, I'm going to present you with a little gift from the Society. Please unwrap it for the public. This is a copy of Constance Wilde's autograph book, which we published last year, and which we launched at the birthday dinner last year, edited by Devon Cox, who's with us tonight. Devon, where are you? Down around there. So Dominic, when you get sick of signing your book, Devon will be happy to sign your copy of that. The autograph book was only made possible by the great generosity of our sponsor, Joan Winchell, who has a great collection of Oscar Wilde material and who is a great lover and admirer of Oscar and his works. Joan was so pleased with the outcome of the autograph book that she is now sponsoring another book, which we will be launching next year, perhaps at the next birthday dinner, which will be a collection of articles from The Woman's World, the journal which Oscar edited between 1887 and 1889. These articles have never been published before, and thanks to Mrs. Winchell's sponsorship, they will be seeing the light of day for the first time in over 100 years. So Dominic, who knows, perhaps you'll be with us next year and we'll be presenting you with a copy of The Woman's World. But meanwhile, thank you very much indeed for coming to talk to us tonight. We're most grateful.
Thank you.